Hi everyone, I'm Dave Gaskin. Welcome to this 30-minute extended cut of the colouring Princess Leia card that you may have seen the time-lapse of. This is slightly different. This is a longer version with a full artist narration, and I try to explain my thought process as I'm colouring and explain some of the decisions I make working with Copic markers. If you like this longer version of the video and you find it helpful, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And if you're not yet subscribed, the button should be down here somewhere. So yeah, check it out and hopefully see you guys soon. So, as you can see, and what I normally do actually is try and choose my colours before I start the card, particularly when I'm going to be recording it like I am with this one. I tend to spend a lot of time picking and choosing my colours, changing my mind, thinking I've found the perfect skin tone, and then switching to something else. So when I'm sort of planning ahead a little bit and working on something like this, I try and line them all up in front of me, as you can see. And I think with this card it worked to an extent. I have a spare card sat to the side, and it's exactly the same cardstock, so what I'll often do is just do little swatches, kind of the equivalent of an artist's palette, just with the pens that I think I'm going to be using. I'll make a little mark with them, just see if I think it's going to be the right colour, and then I'll add it to the lineup. There's quite a broad variety of colours in this particular shot. We've got a strong light, as you'll see in a little while, coming in from the right hand side of the image, casting some really strong orange-red light on Leia's hair and the side of her face. And so those are the colours, because that particular colour is quite crucial to the success of the card. You know, it's an iconic moment in the movie, so definitely something I've tried to do more recently is when I'm looking for references to work from, rather than choosing a nice portrait, you know, the face looks great, lots of detail, I'll also be looking at the colours, and if I think the colour scheme is going to be a challenge, because it's always good to push yourself, if it's going to, you know, break the comfort zone a little bit, that's the sort of thing that I've started to look for recently. Now the video here is playing at twice the speed, so it looks like I'm working fairly quickly. It's not that much faster than how I normally work, but if you've already seen the 3-minute time-lapse video of this card, obviously you don't see a lot of the practice swings, as I like to call them, and the umming and ahhing, you know, the pauses in between. And that's something I try to make myself do, is every now and again just pause and have a look at what you've done. It can be very easy to get tunnel vision in a way when you're working on a card at speed. You know, you think it's going really well, you might be honed in entirely on the face, and you might forget to make sure that the contrast is correct, and the overall colours are looking good, and the contrast and the stuff like that. So here with the skin tones on this one, I think the colours that I picked out early on were kind of a reddish pink, an orange pink. If you're a Copic user, it would have been the EO1, EO2 kind of range, but then I also ended up using more R01, R02, the very light pink colours. In the reference image, Leia's got quite pink cheeks, so I made sure that was something I added in. It comes in a little bit later, but that's the sort of thing that I like to look for, and again, something I've learned over the years on working not just at trading card size, which brings a lot of challenges all of its own, is just studying the reference for a little while. And if you're trying to capture likeness, it's looking at what makes that face recognisable. Obviously, you know, features are crucial, the positioning of the features, but then also the tone and the colour and the contrast and the shadowing. That informs the structure of the face, and as well as the features being in the right place, you also need to get the shape of the face right when you're adding in the colour and the tone and the shadows and all of that sort of thing. So at the moment I'm still putting in that foundation layer. I always start very light. I think that's just me being tentative. Working with colour is kind of new to me. I've been doing it for a few years now, but if you look back at my work in sort of 2014, 2015, going into 2016, I very rarely worked with colour. I learned to draw with graphite pencils, as many people do. So it was very much a world of black and white and studying highlight and shadow. And I think that's where my foundation for capturing shape and lightness, that's where it came from, really, I think. And it's just practice. I mean, there's no shortcut there. But yeah, it's definitely, I started in grayscale for a long time. At school I did art, and I never really dabbled with paint. It was always graphite pencil. I don't really remember using much else, to be honest. I think they kind of tried to encourage us to, but my art teacher at secondary school, so high school, didn't really push us to force us to use anything necessarily. They just kind of let us follow our own path, which in hindsight was I guess we were really lucky that that's how it worked. But yeah, using colour is still fairly new to me. I've definitely grown in confidence with it, I'd say in the last 18 months or so. The first official trading card set I worked on was Terminator 2, and the invite for that, and because the company were based in the UK, once I'd accepted the invite for that, the cards arrived really quickly, and they wanted them to be mostly in colour where possible. Some companies don't mind, they're perfectly happy to take black and white cards, but I think colour cards are definitely more popular, and collectors have all sorts of tastes. What one person likes another doesn't, and vice versa. So I realised that to really push myself and try and learn something new, and take another step forward on this artistic journey, the next stage seemed to naturally just be to start working with colour. So with Terminator 2, I'd studied the work of a few people. Drew Struzan is a big hero of mine, and I'd recently bought a DVD that he had put out, which documented his entire process for how he works and the foundation layers where he works in black and white. He uses a lot of airbrush and paint, obviously, which isn't something that I do, but I try to translate the technique a little bit. And so with the Terminator cards, I was doing a grayscale foundation layer. So the work that I'm doing on the layer card here, on the Terminator cards, was black and white. It was grayscale Copic markers, which was the first time I'd tried using them at that size as well. I'd done Inktober in 2016, in October 2016, where you draw something every day using ink, as the name suggests. And I started using mostly fine liners, but then worked on to move towards working on toned paper with fine liners, but then shading them with Copic markers. So I gained a foundation there in how to use marker, and learning how to blend, which came in really handy. So when it came to T2, I started with the grey foundation layer and then tried adding colour on the top. But the colours were very muddy, and I didn't know back then, but now I like my colours to be a bit more vibrant. And I think when you go straight in with colour, as I've done this one, you get the pure colour. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doing a grayscale foundation layer first. There's no right and wrong way really to do anything when it comes to art. It's whatever you're happy with and whatever you have to do to get the results you want, I think. So I was working with a grey foundation, and then I was adding colour over the top. At that point I didn't have a huge number of markers to work with, so I was using at the time the Letraset Pro markers, which are now Winsor & Newton markers. And so over the grayscale layer, if the overall colour cast was blue or orange, I'd be using a fairly pale blue or orange over the top to get that foundation colour. And then I was working with polychromos pencils to get some finer detail. And it worked, I got through the set, and it was a great experience as a first set. I'm a massive fan of T2, and those of you who follow me on social media will know that I've recently revisited one of the cards that I drew on that first set of the T1000. in the factory with that fantastic orange lighting and the glow of the molten metal behind him. So yeah, the card was a great success, and around the same time I got my first invite from Topps to work on a Star Wars set, and so I was very relieved that I'd had a first official set which wasn't Star Wars because doing a Star Wars set was really the top of my bucket list in terms of what I wanted to do. Up until that point I'd really just been drawing for myself, and so when it came to working on Star Wars, I decided not to necessarily start with grayscale, and I did go straight in with colour. Looking back at the cards now, I'm still really proud of them. They look great, but I can also see where I've improved over the years since that set. So it's always good to have a goal in mind, but not set your heart on a time frame perhaps to fit it in. Just kind of know where you're going, but don't set yourself a time frame to get there, I would say. So now with Leia here, you can see I'm starting to add in the reddish orange lighting that's coming in from the right hand side. I think the foundation of the face is mostly done at this point. The red of the lips, the lipstick is quite a vivid colour, but I tend to put something like that in fairly late. I'll get the majority of the face done first, so that because there's a risk if you put the bolder, more vivid colours down early that they may get smudged, or when you're trying to blend, there's a risk that it might leak over into an area that you don't really want that colour to be. So again, I'm tentatively here, that side of her face where I'm working now is meant to be the same colour as the reddish orange on her hair, but I was very cautious about choosing the wrong colour. I think the colours that I'd picked out at the beginning in my lineup on my little scratch card, my little card to the side that I was practicing with that colour on, wasn't quite working for me. So the reddish colour on her cheek perhaps needed to be a bit more vivid. But I don't know if I had the right colour. It's always difficult to know, and these colours, once they're dry, they change slightly as well. So I think that's why I tend to jump around from one area of the card to another. Spending some time working on the hair means that the work that I've done on the face has a chance to dry, and even leaving a card overnight and coming back to it the next day, it can often look quite different. I prefer to work in daylight ideally, not bright sunlight, just natural daylight. I have a daylight lamp as well, which I tend to work with if it's more in the winter months. Obviously this one was drawn in the summer, so I was able to rely on the natural daylight, but finding a lighting setup that you're comfortable with, because obviously some light bulbs can cast a yellow colour to the room, and so the daylight lamp that I have is kind of an LED strip, very neutral tone to it. So it means that when you're working underneath it, you get a fairly accurate representation of the colours that you're working with as you're looking at it. So the hair, and I have to be honest, every time I do hair, I have no idea what I'm doing. I know it kind of looks like I do know, and maybe that's because it's playing back at twice the speed, but hair is always something I've struggled with. Looking back at my older graphite pieces, I would often just stop at the hairline, and it would just be the shape of the face but no hair, unless it was really dark and I could just scribble with the graphite and get it just blocked in. Anything that required a bit more detail I tended to avoid. And when I was working digitally, because I worked digitally for quite a long time, I taught myself how to use Photoshop, started doing digital portraits. Oh, and there we go. Another thing I like to do is document the progress of how something is looking, so that I can, share work in progress photos. So yeah, hair is something that I've always found tricky. But the great thing about making contacts through the work with Topps and the artist network, which is really strong, everybody supports each other, which is great. But it allows you to sort of study everybody else's work and seeing how other people approach it, which can be enlightening a lot of the time. You look at your own process, and you compare it to how someone else has done it, and perhaps they've done it more easily, more quickly, which is often a really helpful thing to try and achieve with these trading cards. When it's the official cards, deadlines can often be quite short, so it's good to find a way to achieve the same results but quicker. But this one, obviously, this is a personal card drawn for a fundraiser. I think the overall time for this colouring stage was about an hour, so this video is being played at double speed and it's just shy of 30 minutes, so in real time this was an hour's work, and I'd say that's kind of standard for my stuff. Sometimes I'll spend a little bit longer. A recent set, the top set, Chrome Perspectives, I did a 3-card puzzle, which is quite rare for me. Normally I don't work with puzzles, especially not 3-card puzzles, but again I was just trying to push myself, and the colour scheme for that and the amount of detail involved meant that it took a lot longer than an hour, a lot longer than 3 hours even, with 3 cards. But this one, I think because the face is a fairly small amount of the card, and it's often the face that I spend the longest time working on, meant that it didn't take as long as it perhaps could have done. If I'd gone for a closer crop and the face was a bit bigger, I would then be trying to get more detail in there. So now you can see, as I've moved on to the clothing, I've picked up a neutral grey. I think I used neutral 1, 2, 3 in the Copic range. Just quickly, really, just suggesting shadows and creases and folds. It helps that the clothing is white. That means it's going to be a lot quicker. And then I've just started there, as you can see, adding in the early orange highlights. At this point I decided that I'd throw some green in there. I don't think there's necessarily any green on the reference image, but green and orange complement each other quite well, green and red, complementary colours. And so although it's a fairly subtle addition, the green doesn't really stand out, it's not that vivid. It's something that I hadn't planned to do. So you see me, what I'm actually doing there is just reaching across to the bunch of Copics and trying to pick out a suitable green shade that won't overwhelm the image. And that's another thing that I've tried to do recently, is rather than slavishly trying to copy the colours in the reference, is try and work a little bit looser and work with colours that aren't necessarily there. Everybody's eyes see things differently, and it's going to be rare that you look at this card side by side with the original reference, and it's taken me a while to do that, really, is to let the detail go a little bit and not be too concerned with every pore and every strand of hair. It would take a lot longer to draw hair that way. That's certainly one thing I've learned about drawing hair, is don't try and draw every strand, because often hair can look a little bit overworked, and you can tell that somebody's tried really hard to make it look realistic, but occasionally it might not match the realism achieved in the facial features itself. Obviously somebody working in a super photorealistic, hyper-realistic style, they need to spend that time working on their hair, but generally I try and keep it fairly brief. It's helpful working with the Copics that they have the brush tip, because with the brush tip you can use quite sweeping, quick movements, and you can also blend the colours and sort of suggest a shift in tone. So with this now, I'm just darkening the shadows in the clothing just a little bit, starting to shade some more on the arm, adding the shadow here now, and I think at this point, and I think on the face as well, rather than using greys to add shadow, I was using purples and violets, quite light shades initially, but then getting slightly darker around the eyes, and then that patch of reddish orange on the cheek, separating that area, and then the natural skin tone area is a slightly darker strip. It's fairly subtle, but if you look at an image where half of the face is in one lighting setup and the other half is in the other, quite often there'll be a very dark section separating the two, and that's the sort of thing you want to look for if you're trying to achieve realism with your lighting and that sort of thing. So here I've started working on the background. I tend not to ink the backgrounds most of the time, simply because I want the focus to be the figure or the face. So I think I'd used, one of my plastic templates with those curved lines, just to make that, just with a pencil, just lightly, just to give myself a guide to work with, but not so that you would see it too obviously on the finished card. The background in the reference was in focus. I quite like it. I quite like working on cards and where the background is out of focus. That really makes the character and the figure in the foreground pop, which is nice. So on the recent Star Wars set, I've done that on quite a few cards, and it works really nicely. And so with this one, just working generally, just blocking in colours quite loosely at this stage. I'm going to add a little bit more detail, but not too much. I'm not going to spend ages trying to, render a super realistic metallic texture. It would just be suggesting the texture, really. And a lot of the time, especially with trading cards at this size, they're only 2.5 by 3.5 inches, so there's only so much you can do without getting magnifying glasses out, and I do that occasionally. I have they're very attractive, a set of magnifying goggles that kind of sit over the top of my glasses, and that just helps when you're working, on a face, for example, a really small area and you want to get the detail right. That does help, but certainly with the background here, I'm just working fairly quickly. The green, the bluish, like the greenish blue over on the left, I wanted to try and keep some of that in the image, because it complements the orange lighting on the other side of the card quite nicely. Knocked the camera there, well done, Dave. And then this section, which is currently completely white at the moment, is going to be very dark, and again that will just help the character stand out. I tend to try and crop a reference such that there are interesting elements in it potentially, if I'm going to be including the background, if I'm going to make it worth my while. Otherwise it would be just a simple colour gradient from top to bottom of the card, or the other way around, depending on how much space there is in the background. But for this one, it's such an iconic moment. I had to really include the background of this scene. I think I'm using maybe 2 or 3 sort of greyish browns, quite close in colour and tone really, but there's just enough of a difference that you can suggest darker and lighter areas. There's not much blending going on at this point. There was a fair amount of blending going on with the face, but for the background it's not really necessary, so I'm just working fairly loosely, blocking it in, leaving a few little white specks here and there, random highlights of stuff. It is a metallic texture, so that helps sell the realism. And the same thing will happen with the gun. You'll see in a moment I make it much darker, and sometimes I'll use a white gel pen and it'll be literally the last thing that I do. I think you'll see me coming in with the gel pen a little bit later. So just kind of working the whole card at this point, blocking in the main colours and the main tones just to make sure that they're working. Doing a little bit of detail here. It's like a oily, greasy surface on the metal. That's the sort of detail that I like to add. When I used to work purely in graphite, I was a bit of a detail freak, and I would I would be going in really close and adding in eyelashes and that sort of thing. But a trading card size, and the face that size, it's not really something that you can do without spending a huge amount of time on it. So just adding a bit more texture. The white pen may come out in a moment. So here I'm just making the hair just a little bit darker. The darkness of that background now is the darkest thing on the card, and I want to make sure that the contrast on the figure is kind of similar to the contrast of the rest of it, so I want to make sure that the dark areas on the hair are properly dark. And here we go. This is just adding some slightly more detail to the barrel of the gun. Knocked the camera again, well done. my setup is such that my face, the side of my head is really close to the camera. The camera's just sort of just to the left of me, and I do like to get my face quite close to the card at times to make sure I'm getting the detail right. So yeah, just knocked it a couple of times, but yeah, so there we go, just adding, just quickly adding a few lines, just to suggest that kind of beveled surface on the barrel of the gun, a few seconds, and it just adds a little bit extra detail without having to spend a huge amount of time. I realised that I hadn't gone very dark around the eyes, so she needed a little bit of eyeliner. Her eyebrows are quite pale and quite faint, so I didn't ink those in. So I just used a fairly light brown just to suggest that there's something there. Just a simple 1 or 2 strokes of the pen was enough for that. And then this little metallic debris in the background, not spending too long on that really. It's got a kind of a tubular section there coming in on the right, so the top and the bottom of that will be a little bit darker, just to sell the round shape. Then I realised that the colour I picked would work quite well for adding a little bit more colour to the orange of the hair, make it a bit more vivid, which worked quite nicely. So it's almost done. So really at this stage I'm just looking at, well, what have I got left to do now? So perhaps make the left hand side a little bit darker, and then at some point, oh there we go, that's good, that's well timed. It's almost like I knew what was coming. Make the left hand side a little bit darker. You can see I'm doing some very loose strokes there just to suggest a little bit of texture on that. I think it's the doorway, isn't it, in the corridor. Just suggesting some texture rather than trying to accurately recreate what was actually there. So again there, just a few little upward and downward strokes just to add a little bit of interest, but not distracting too much from the figure, and then just adding a little bit more contrast to the metallic object. Leaving myself, I can go in with the white gel pen to add some highlights on there for the brightest spots. And so I was quite pleased with how this one came out. It's one of those iconic moments from Star Wars that I've not drawn before, but it's always kind of been on my to-do list of shots that I wanted to do. I've seen other people do it. And so I'd waited. So here's the white gel pen, so you can see the dots that I just put in the eyes. It really brings the character to life, and it really is a nice finishing touch. I used to go in and add those dots fairly early, because I like that sudden, the lifelike detail that it brings. And then just going around the card and maybe adding a few highlights in the hair just as a finishing touch. Sometimes I'll use colour pencil, white colour pencil to do this, but I think my preference is the white gel pen, and there we go, all done.